Should we make a start? Okay, so hello everyone. I would like to welcome you all to our open discussion today on crisis and the European Union that is organized by Andalusia, which is the front of the anti-capitalist revolutionary communist left and radical ecology movement and party. So we are delighted to have some speakers today, and we think that in light of the upcoming European Parliament elections, it is more important than ever that we open this discussion and we contribute in order to examine the nature of the European Union as a capital integration project and the political strategies that the left and the Labour movement must develop in order to respond, not only in Greece but in all countries of the European Union. So we are happy to have our speakers today. So before we start, let me introduce the speakers. So we have Vassalos Giorgos, who is a PhD candidate at Strasbourg University in Political Science. He is a member of Andalusia in Belgium and member of the Brussels Greek Solidarity Initiative, and he's writing extensively on European Union issues. Then we have Panagiotis Sotiris, who is an academic in political theory at the Department of Communication and Media in Athens, and he's a member of the Central Committee of Andalusia, and he's also the author of numerous papers and books on social and political theory. And last but not least, we have Alex Kalianikos with us, a political activist and theorist, professor of European Studies at King's College, leading member of the SWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, and editor of the International Socialism. So our speakers are going to speak for 20 minutes each, and then we have an hour when we can open the discussion. You can ask questions, make interventions, and then our speakers will come back for 10 minutes each to close the discussion. There is also a sheet where you can write down your email so we can inform you about future events and keep you in our contacts. So, would you like to?
Okay, I think this is working. Okay, I think it's worthwhile starting off this discussion by asking, what is the EU? What kind of entity is the EU? Now, if you listen to the EU's own ideology, how it presents itself as a form of power, but a peculiarly benign form of power. It's often, EU leaders often talk about the EU as being a normative power. In other words, a political entity. I have to say entity or something like that, because it's not a state. It's very hard to define what it is. I mean, Perry Anderson wrote a book in which he said that the European Union was harder to understand than the Byzantine Empire had been, which, of course, for us here might seem slightly offensive, but never mind. But the EU presents itself as a political force in the world that promotes a liberal form of globalization, and which is characterized in particular by its use of soft power. In other words, the EU, unlike the United States, doesn't rely on military power. It relies rather on trade and diplomacy, and most particularly on the strength of its values. It's its values that are the really powerful thing about the EU. And although that self-image is, I think, completely false, we should recognize that it does have an attractive power. However we try to understand what's happened in Ukraine, one element of what happened in Ukraine was that a substantial number of people rose up against the government of Yanukovych because he rejected the option of closer partnership with the European Union, and this was cutting them off, they believe, from this particularly benign entity that is the EU. So even though the ideology is false, it's necessary to recognise that it has a certain power, a certain attraction, maybe particularly outside the EU these days, less and less within the EU, as is very clear in the upcoming European parliamentary elections. So what is the EU really? The EU really is an essentially capitalist, indeed an imperialist project. But if we compare it with other capitalist and imperialist projects, most obviously that of the United States, the European imperialist project suffers from profound flaws that make it that we see very, very, very clearly. So, what's the essential nature of the European project? The essential nature of the European project, from its inception in 1950, with the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community, has been an attempt by the leading European capitalist states more effectively to prosecute their interests not just on a European but on a global scale by partially pooling their sovereignty. In other words, weakened as a result of the two world wars, the European states, most importantly initially France and West Germany, later on in particular Britain, decide they can maintain their position globally most effectively if they seek to cooperate, at least in certain dimensions. This suffers from the start and still from two inherent limitations. The first is that the interests, particularly of the leading European capitalist states, aren't uniform. There are conflicts of interest between them. At the minute, we all talk about the way in which Germany is undertaking a hegemonic role within the European Union and the kind of tensions that exist between Germany and the other leading European capitalist states. But this is just a feature that has been true since the EU's inception. One very obvious line of conflict is between Britain and the other leading European capitalist states, because the British ruling class has pursued a strategy of geopolitically binding themselves to the United States, particularly in the dimensions of defence and of foreign policy. This is closely accompanied by the role of the city as a global financial centre. This pulls away from the much more, if you like, European orientation of the other leading European capitalist states. So, from its inception, the EU has been riven by internal conflict. Secondly, I said the EU is an imperialist project, and that's true, and it's very interesting the way in recent years the ideologues of the EU talk in much more explicit terms of the EU being an empire. There's a German academic called Münkler who wrote a book about empires a few years ago, in which he said the EU has increasingly to function as an empire on its particularly on its eastern frontier. Barroso, the particularly unpleasant and incompetent president of the European Commission, said something similar. The EU is an empire quite recently. So they avow their imperial ambitions, but these ambitions are greatly limited because of the interdependence between the EU and the United States. And this is an interdependence which is asymmetric. In lots of ways, the US is the dominant partner. So if we look at the history of European integration, the EU-US plays a major role in promoting European integration. Not because it's not as an end in itself, but because the American ruling class after the Second World War comes to the conclusion that they will be more able effectively to dominate Europe if they have a stable federal European junior partner. And so, in all sorts of ways that I don't have time to go into the details of, the American state pushes and promotes European integration in the key phase from the late 1940s onwards. This support for EU integration and the expansion, these days the expansion of the European Union, has continued to be a key element in US global policy. So the great expansion of the EU into Eastern and Central Europe was part of a package deal. It was part of a package deal that involved the expansion not just of the EU, but of NATO. And the architects of this policy, people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a US presidential national security advisor in the late 1970s, but very much was one of the main theorists of the whole strategy of EU-NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War. He's very clear, the more the EU expands in combination with NATO, the more extensive the US domination of the Eurasian continent becomes. And we can see the interconnection between EU and NATO expansion very, very clearly in the case of the Ukraine crisis. Why was Putin so hostile to Ukraine forming a partnership agreement with the EU? Partly he was worried about Russia losing markets in the Ukraine, but he was also worried that along with integration in the EU would come integration into NATO. And that would bring NATO directly onto the borders of Russia. So the interdependence between the EU and the US and the way in which essentially the EU plays a subordinate role has come out very clearly recently. And more generally, the limitations in the kind of imperialist project that the EU is have been exposed very brutally in the last 5 years. Very clearly in the case of the Eurozone crisis. The Eurozone crisis was essentially, the origins of the Eurozone crisis was in the crisis of the European banking system, the way in which the European banks became threatened with bankruptcy because of their role in feeding the credit bubble in the United States, but also all sorts of credit bubbles within the EU itself. But the explosion of that crisis exposed the limitations of the EU. First of all, when it came to rescuing the banks, it wasn't the EU that did it, it was the different national governments. Ireland rescued its banks, Britain rescued its banks, Germany rescued its banks, and so on and so forth. And when it came to the debt crisis in the so-called Eurozone periphery, the way in which the so-called rescues took place, which were rescues of the banks, not, I don't need to tell a Greek audience, not a rescue of the countries and the peoples in the affected countries, that was done in a way that transferred the costs of the rescues onto the populations of those countries and have severely weakened the coherence of the Eurozone. There's been a striking renationalization of finance in the Eurozone, which undermines the coherence and effectiveness of the Eurozone. But we see this also very clearly in the cases of the crisis over the Ukraine, because here we see the limits of the EU's expansionist ambitions. When the crisis develops in Ukraine, when the Yanukovych retreats from the partnership agreement with the EU, and that sparks off opposition, at least in the western part of Ukraine and Kiev, the reaction of the EU is to press even harder on political and economic elites in Ukraine to remove Yanukovych and to sign up to the partnership agreement with the EU. The problem is that then produces the geopolitical crisis that we see at the present time, with the reaction by Russia for the reasons that I described earlier. And suddenly normative power, soft power, all that kind of stuff doesn't count anymore, because Putin is using hard power to try and push the balance of forces back in his favor. The hardest kind of hard power are tanks, and that's what the Russians and special forces and so on, troops, military force, And when it comes to military force, the EU is a weakling. Not simply because it doesn't exist as a military entity, in as much as the EU is a military entity, it's as part of NATO. It's as part of NATO. But also because all the EU governments have been slashing their military spending in recent years. That's true of the states with imperial ambitions, like France and Britain, but it's also true of the smaller EU states, the Baltic states, in response to the Eurozone crisis, the financial crisis, slashed their military budgets massively. Now they're going into reverse. But the EU is militarily puny. So suddenly the big bad United States, which is supposed to be inferior to the EU because it uses hard power and invades countries, it's the US that is called back into play. It's Obama who goes to Brussels this last week to stiffen the backs of the Europeans. It's Obama who's negotiating with Putin over an attempt to resolve the crisis. It's the US that's pushing the EU into greater sanctions. And this isn't just about the EU's lack of military power, it's also about the divisions inside the EU. The way in which not simply are large parts of the EU heavily dependent on Russian gas, but deeply implicated in trade with Russia, investment in Russia. This last week, the head of Siemens, one of the greatest German industrial companies, went to Moscow and had a special meeting with Putin in which he reaffirmed the importance of economic links between Russia and Germany. So the Ukraine crisis has very cruelly exposed the limits of the EU's own imperialist project. However, that doesn't mean that we should just say, who cares about the EU? They're too pathetic and feeble an entity for us to worry about. Because it's not the European ruling classes who pay the price for the EU's failure. So who's paid the price for the Eurozone crisis? Again, I don't have to tell an audience of Greeks. It's been the working people of, in particular, the so-called Eurozone periphery, but more broadly, the working people of Europe, who have paid the price through the implementation of austerity. And we can see the pursuit of the same policy when it comes to Ukraine. Lucky Ukraine. Now they're being drawn into the warmth of the freedom of the European project. So what's happening? The Troika has arrived in Kiev. Not all the Troika. The European Central Bank isn't involved yet. But the other two, the European Commission and the IMF, are in Kiev. And they're saying, we'll lend you money, but guess what? You have to implement austerity. So on the 1st of May, the Ukrainians can celebrate their liberation from Yanukovych by having their domestic gas prices increased by 50%. And the politicians are saying, it's all right, it's the summer, people won't notice. So we see that there's, despite the fact that the EU is a flawed imperialist project, inherently flawed imperialist project, it's a project that is also a vicious one in terms of its consequences for ordinary people. Now, the final point I want to make is about how we respond politically to this. Now, I think we have to have revolutionaries and Marxists have to have a general stance of principled opposition to the EU as a capitalist and imperialist project. When there was a referendum in Britain in 1975 over Britain's membership of what was then the European Economic Community, the predecessor of the SWP, like the bulk of the left in Britain, campaigned for a no vote. Unfortunately, we lost. And that kind of stance is the basic one that I think the revolutionary Marxist left should take. What this means concretely, I think, varies according to the situation. Antasia has this very good program to address the Eurozone crisis involving cancelling the debt, nationalising the banks, breaking with the euro. That, I think, is one of the strongest parts of Antasia's appeal, and it's one that should be taken up by the radical and revolutionary left in other parts of the Eurozone. What does that mean here in Britain, though? Britain Britain isn't part of the Eurozone. So it doesn't mean anything to campaign for leaving the Euro. There's also, but more seriously, the complication in Britain is that the debate on the EU is dominated by the right. I mean, it used to be the right wing of the Tory party, but now it's even worse. It's the xenophobic populists of UKIP, of the UK Independence Party, that dominate the debate. I don't think in those circumstances we must campaign for a referendum on EU membership. In present circumstances, that will only work in favour of the right, not the left. And there's in the European elections in this country, there's a coalition of the radical left, that is standing in the parliamentary elections in this country around the slogan "No to EU." Despite our great respect for the comrades involved in that, like Bob Crow, the leader of the RMT, who died a couple of weeks ago, we have great respect for the comrades involved to No to EU. We don't think it's the best terrain, for the reason I've just given, that it's the best terrain for the left to fight on. And one of the issues in which No to EU is ambiguous, at least, is on the question of the free movement of labour inside the EU. As I'm sure you know, this is something that increasingly the right are campaigning about. They're saying that one of the worst effects of the EU is the way in which all these, these people from Eastern and Central Europe, the Roma, etc., are coming and taking the low-paid jobs and undercutting British workers and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, there are people on the left who have partly accommodated with that. A few years ago, there was a campaign in the British Labour movement for British jobs for British workers. I think that's the wrong way to respond to the EU. I think that as a matter of principle, revolutionaries have to be against all immigration controls. We shouldn't confuse opposition to the EU with opposition to one consequence of the EU, which is free movement of workers within the EU, which is there for the interests of the capitalists, but also represents in a very limited and partial way what we would like to see on a global scale. We want people to be able to move from country to country. This doesn't mean that we should defend the EU, but we should certainly put ourselves absolutely frontally in opposition to the people who primarily are the coalition government in this country and UKIP, who are targeting migrants from the rest of Europe. And this illustrates a very important point. In our opposition to the EU, we have to be careful that our opposition doesn't become confused with that of the nationalist right. Our opposition has to be on a very clearly internationalist basis, because to go back to the beginning of what I said, part of the appeal of the EU is this appearance of, this normative power that is overcoming national antagonisms and so on and so forth. That's attractive to people because people don't like national antagonisms for very good reasons that we'll be reminded of in August with the centenary of the First World War. So we have to make sure that our stance against the EU is principled, anti-capitalist and internationalist.
Thank you very much, Alex. So now your voice is going to continue.
Thank you very much. It's a challenge to speak after Alex, but I will try. So I will start by saying that the global crisis of capitalism started in 2008. From all the imperialist centers, the one that was harder hit was the European Union. And this is surely due to its very special institutional architecture, but also to the status of the euro as a young currency that quickly ascended as the second global currency since 1999. And euro was a very special currency because it was the first currency that was not backed by a specific powerful state, but a hybrid organization. Alex also tried to put a name on it. It's not really easy. It's something between a federation and an intergovernmental alliance, I would say. And still, the euro was not backed by the entire membership of this alliance, as you know very well here in Britain. So financialization and the extensive use of credit was globally the way that capitalism chose in order to circumvent the last big crisis in the 70s, but also the sphere from which, financial sphere was the sphere from which the current crisis was triggered. But indebtedness in the EU had very special characteristics. Since in the beginning of the euro, all the member states could borrow with the same interest rates as Germany. This was good for industrial and financial capital in the most industrialist EU nations, but it was also good for the dominant classes in the internal periphery of the EU, so countries like Greece, since they could shift in a profitable way from manufacturing to more services and transport-centered business. But of course, in times of crisis, access to cheap credit had to be cut, and then a very critical question came to the fore. And this question was, who is finally to pay for the debts that different governments have been making towards banks? And this question, of course, radically shaken the whole institutional balance of the EU. So richer countries could bail out their banks on their own, with their own taxpayers' money. So that was the case for the UK, for France, for Germany, but that was not the case for Greece, Ireland, Cyprus, or Spain. Plus, it was not only the local banks that they were saving through these bailouts, but also the banks from the core countries that would otherwise suffer big losses. So the richer countries accepted to foot the bill for this debt problem, but with some conditions. And these conditions were, to put it in a very blunt way, was actually to completely ridiculize democracy in the peripheral countries, and also transform them in cheap labor camps for the European capital. So the reaction of the EU to the crisis was to accelerate a movement towards a bureaucratic and autocratic federalization with no democratic basis. And this is the political tool in Europe in order to advance the triple recipe of the ruling classes to go out of the crisis. So the first is reducing labor cost. The second is retain capitalist control over financial institutions. And the third is relax the protection of the environment and destroy the welfare state in order to create new profitable markets for capital. So how did the EU advance in this agenda? Since 2010, it started a radical overhaul of its economic governance structure. So first, so it was a series of reforms to centralize economic governance in Brussels. First, there was legislation called the Six-Pack on Economic Governance that was building into a previous text of political agreements between the European leaders, which was called the Euro Pact, the Pact for the Euro. So this Six-Pack did basically two things. The first was that it made much stricter the deficit, the mechanisms to forbid deficits, and made much more automatic penalties for countries that would violate deficit limits. Therefore, it provided a tool that would force member states to cut the welfare state and public services in a much more radical way. The second thing brought by the Six-Pack of Economic Governance was a brand new framework of macroeconomic surveillance that gives Brussels the right to intervene in many economic policy fields. The most important is the limit on labor unit cost in relation to GDP. So they introduced a rule that says that this should not increase by more than 9% in 3 years for the Eurozone countries and not more than 12% for the non-Euro countries. So what is effectively banned through this rule is redistribution of the GDP from capital to labor. You just can't do it anymore, even if your government wants it. It's against the legislation on economic governance. Then this legislative package was followed up by the Two-Pack on economic governance, a second wave, that actually obliged all the member states to submit their draft budgets to the Commission and accept amendments to these budgets in case they were in excessive deficit situations, which, by the way, is the situation of the majority of the EU member states. So the unelected bureaucracy of Brussels got one more tool in order to impose cuts. And the second thing with the two-pack was that the Commission now has the right to ask from member states that are in a risky position with their public finances to that now you should enter in the Troika mechanism. So up to now, it was the ECB that would threaten, it happened in Portugal, it happened in Italy, that would threaten that it would cut off the liquidity of private banks, and then the government of Portugal, in that case, were obliged to ask Troika's help. But now the Commission can say, okay, now you have to ask for help, and of course there are not a lot of margins to say no. And then there was the most recent revision of the cohesion funds legislation. So the cohesion funds is the only mechanism that has some redistributive function, even if it is really questionable, because it doesn't, of course, change the structure of the economy. It is rather it rather offers one more profitability opportunity to corporations, but anyhow, even these cohesion funds, they can now be frozen if the economic recommendations of the Commission are not followed. Then we had this treaty on stability, convergence and economic governance, which the UK likely didn't sign, which obliged member states to put this structural deficit limit of 0.5%. And the EU Court of Justice is put as a watchdog to monitor if all the member states have indeed put it in their constitutions or basic laws. And so during this time, we had these ad hoc mechanisms, first in Greece and then to the other 4 Eurozone countries, with the EFSF, the ESM, that were actually putting the European Commission together with the ECB and the Troika in the driving seat in these countries. They were really governing the economies until the least detail. But in the same time, the EU implemented a reform that actually will increase radically its capacity of interference in the economic policy in all EU member states, and not only those under the Troika. Now it looks that the UK government doesn't need the EU to impose cuts. It's imposing cuts anyway. But let's say that you have the possibility to, if you want it, you can change that through elections. But even for the EU, this straight jacket of unit labor cost is there. Of course, in the Eurozone there are much more tools in order to enforce this rule. But let's say that, for instance, in Greece, there are chances that the radical left party comes in government very soon. But it would be very difficult to follow any pro-labor, pro-welfare, pro-public investment expansionary policies without coming in an all-out conflict with the EU. And what is the very concrete result of this? Is Syriza saying already that it will also strive for budget surplus, because it's very clear that it doesn't want to get in this all-out conflict with the EU. So you see how all these mechanisms that are built do not exist only in a theoretical level, and it's not only about when they will be indeed enforced and about whether a fine will be imposed indeed, but they create a whole political climate that really discourages following other kinds of policies. Now, the other big project that is underway within the European Union is the banking union. So this is trying to reply in this question: who is paying for the bailouts finally? The taxpayer from which country? But what it does really, first of all, is shielding the banks from the prospect of default and the prospect of real nationalization. So the new framework really makes sure that these two things will not happen. The banks cannot just go bust like that, go default like that, and also
there is no option of really nationalizing a bank and make it function as a public service under workers and democratic control, etc., etc. So when a bank is considered problematic, 4 steps are put forward. The first is to look if there is any other bank that can take it over. The second is to save it through a bail-in, so that the shareholders and the depositors of the banks bear some cost. This, of course, includes SMEs, it includes professionals, and it includes public organisms. We saw that in Greece with a haircut, we saw it in Cyprus. It also includes sovereign bonds. You know, state in general, public deposits that are in these private banks, and these are in this kind of bail-ins. There are the ones that will pay the highest price, because the private shareholders and investors, they can see the danger coming, have much more tools to see the danger coming, and much more capacities to take their money out of a problematic bank. The third step is a national bailout, so find money to taxpayers' money in order to save the bank in question, and the fourth is finally bail it out through the European stability mechanism. Now, I haven't looked at the implications of this framework on the British big 5 banks, but within the Eurozone it will certainly facilitate the concentration of the whole continental financial sector in the hands of a few German, French, and perhaps a couple of other countries' banks, and it will create actually even bigger to fail banks. And all decisions regarding which steps will be taken and which solution will be given in any bank, for any bank in danger, will be given by a body within the ESM, in which every country has votes according to its capital that it has deposited to the European Stability Mechanism. So that practically gives 25% of the votes to Germany, 21% to France, and in general 6 countries out of the 17 of the Eurozone will have 85% of the voting rights. So, I mean, I think it's quite clear that the German state will help German banks to take over more banks in the Eurozone space, if this reform is ever to be put in practice, because this is also a question actually. And basically, the taxpayers will continue footing the bill. In around 12 years' time from now, it is supposed that they will create a fund in which banks will contribute in order to do the bailouts. But this is a very long time. We cannot take this for granted. So instead of limiting the size of the speculative sphere in order to make the majority of banks' assets, like to reduce the size of the banks, so to reduce the cost of the bailouts, EU legislators continue to find ways to make workers through their taxes to pay for the failures of the banks. We will come back to this. Now, there is another feature of this whole EU project, which is, I think Panagiotis will also talk a bit about that, which is constitutionalism without democratic legitimacy. So Alex spoke before about this idea of pooling the sovereignty of different states, but actually this new pooled sovereignty, it's not the same for everybody. So I just explained within the banking union, for instance, how wealthy nations acquire more institutional rights in governing the EU economy, but you have other ways. So in general, net contributors in cohesion funds and also countries with lower deficits are seen as much more legitimate within the EU institutions, and they speak with from a completely different level than other member states. And of course, the size of the corporate sectors of different countries counts very much. So only countries with a bigger number of corporations with global activity will really have a say, for instance, on global trade policies. And the EU is very strong in global trade policies. Schäuble, the financial minister of Germany, but also in official council documents, you can see very clearly, they say it very clearly, national sovereignty has to be reduced. It is reduced, and we should keep reducing it. But then in the question, what happens with democratic sovereignty, the answer is not really clear. Because we all know that democratic sovereignty, for instance, and in the last centuries, existed basically in the national level. And if we ask ourselves what elements of democratic sovereignty we have in the EU level, then we should be frank and actually not talk about a democratic political system in the EU level. Because in the EU jargon it's often mentioned as the democratic deficit. I think it is a completely fallacious way to describe it, because actually all the basic elements that characterize democratic political systems are not there. Only one of the three institutions is elected, and that's the weakest one, the Parliament. The Commission, which is an unelected bureaucratic body, has the monopoly of legislative initiative. And then you have the Council of Ministers that has to co-approve the legislative projects of the Commission, which is actually a field of secret diplomacy. So citizens cannot change the individuals in the tops of the EU institutions through elections, and they can also not change them by street demonstrations and strikes, as it is often the case in the national level. Democratic control is simply not among the criteria that the EU leaders have in mind when they talk about this new EU sovereignty or pooled sovereignty. So they talk about discipline to laws. For instance, in the text of the ECB, it is said that from the moment that there is enforcement of contracts in a certain area and intellectual property rights are equally respected in a certain area, then it's okay, we have a political union. But I think we can say that this is for sure not a democratic political union. So for us, as Marxists, of course, democracy is not something eternal and unchanged into time. It either spreads to the economic sphere, it either changes its class nature, etc., or either it disappears and we go back to much more openly oligarchic forms. And this is what is happening for the moment, unless we manage to achieve big political changes in this new age of revolts that we're seeing around us. But I think that the EU is clearly the basic way in which the financialized corporate class is organizing its political oligarchy and its autocracy in Europe. That doesn't mean that by dissolving it, we improve the situation automatically, but it does mean that it should be seen by us clearly as a weapon in the hands of a class enemy, and not as something that can be reformed and taken over by subordinated classes. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to describe the corporate footprint in all these EU institutions, because there are very concrete ways in which corporations are involved in all stages of decision making. But I have to say that on the other hand, it is also the respect of rights that is diminishing, of civic rights, of social and economic rights, etc., etc. So there is a sharp contrast between the new powers that the Commission has on the economic policy and the consequences of these policies in the rights situation, in the human rights situation in the different countries, and then the lack of the complete absence of any responsibility or of any way to hold the EU institutions accountable for for human rights violations. And of course, in Greece, there has been massive violation of economic and social rights. That's unquestionable, but also of very basic civic rights. So the response. So the European Union will soon become a member of the European Convention of Human Rights, but actually it will not be. A citizen will not be able to go against the EU. The EU will just choose if there is an EU state that is brought to court. It will choose if it will stand by this member state. So if you go to the Human Rights Court, you will not have to face only a state, but also the European Union. And also they're establishing new procedures regarding violations of fundamental rights that they actually try to interpret by only if the justice is independent. So the only criterion is the justice independent from the executive? If the justice is independent from the executive, then okay, we have rule of law. But they don't anymore relate rule of law with respect of human rights. So, to conclude, there was another source of legitimization that the EU had in the last year, which was the opposition to the so-called two extremes. But a lot of things have happened on that in the last 12, 14 years. So in 2000, there was this extreme right party that was participating in the Austrian government. There was really a crusade from the EU in order to stop this. They didn't manage to stop it, but since then there were many countries where the extreme right participated in government, even with social democrats, as in Slovakia in 2003. And in Greece, actually, it was the EU itself that imposed an extreme right party in the government in 2011, when there was not even need in order to form a parliamentary majority. And that was the first time that an extreme right party was in a governmental coalition in Greece. And I think that recently we crossed one more critical point in this relation between the EU and the extreme right, which was the events in Ukraine, where we actually had a movement that in the final stages of the movement, it was clearly, first of all, an armed movement. They had rifles, they had revolvers, etc. And secondly, clearly controlled by two fascist groups. They were the ones that were calling the shots. Indifferently, if most people agreed with them or not, they were the ones that had the organization lead on this movement. And this movement actually led to a government with around 7 openly Nazi ministers. So we have the EU giving full political support in the first government in Europe since the end of World War II that has people that are openly or almost openly adepts of fascist ideology. I think that this source of legitimization also doesn't exist anymore. It is only one extreme that remains as enemy of the EU, and this is why we think that in order to implement the program that Alex also referred to, the program of Andalusia, debt cancellation, nationalization of the financial system, of energy and basic transport under workers' control, this cannot be done without issuing a national currency and without having this currency under democratic control, so radically changing the model of the central bank. And of course, that means that automatically we will not be applying the basic EU treaties and legislation, so that inevitably will put us in an all-out conflict with the EU that can only have as final result the exit from the EU. So I will leave it here. I think that the left clearly needs to respond to the accusation that whoever dares to propose exit from the EU or a radical break with the logic of the EU is nationalist and reactionary, but in the contrary, putting borders to capital without putting borders to workers is the only way to really build an internationalist alternative in Europe. Thank you.
Ali, wanting to change the tape.
I will start by making this point that whatever is happening in Greece is not just the Greek case. In reality, it's the European Union's attempt to prove that it can be even more efficient than the IMF in implementing a violent change in social paradigm. If you take into consideration what has been happening in Greek society in the past 4 years, it is even more violent than the infamous structural adjustment programs of the IMF, which we should always remember were implemented usually with the help of a military dictatorship. In Greece, we've seen the total contraction of the economy until now has already reached up to 25%. Such a contraction can only be attributed to major warfare. This is or the Big Depression, and even the Big Depression did not reach such magnitude in all countries. I think when Germany and the US arrived at or exceeded this kind of contraction of the economy. We have an official rate of unemployment of 28%. In reality, it's much bigger, and there's a very big percentage of people who are working but are not paid or are not paid regularly. We have a 60% youth unemployment, and we are already witnessing an actual brain drain in Greece with more than 100,000 young university graduates migrating to other countries. I can say some of them in the audience. There's even the Bank of Greece, which is notoriously conservative in its estimates, is saying that there has been a 25% reduction in real wages all over the economy. In reality, in certain sectors, is much, much bigger.